But if I see tens of thousands of ballots being manipulated, I can't go along with that. And I'll tell you what,
does that mean,
from a common sense,
does that mean you're going to tell your people to take to the street?
It means you have a fraudulent election.
President Trump has been loudly insisting for months that this election is going to be rigged, that the mail voting that is happening in such large numbers now is rife with fraud, and that if you don't have a result on election night, there's something wrong with that scenario, there's something unacceptable about that. To be clear, none of that is true.
Obviously, in every election, there are mail-in ballots. Some states only do votes by mail-in ballots, but this year, due to the coronavirus pandemic, a lot of states have expanded their eligibility. The USPS handles more mail at Christmas than they do even for this expected surge in ballots.
2016 really was what experts call the fake news election. It was Russia coming in and spreading all kinds of misinformation in order to help Donald Trump and hurt Hillary Clinton. In 2020, it's Americans who are actually starting it. It's domestic misinformation. So you've got Republicans, you've got the president, especially, really spreading this domestic misinformation. One of the main things that we saw in 2016 was that Russia really targeted African-American voters in the United States. And they would impersonate Black Lives Matter activists or just kind of create all kinds of fake information and fake profiles and, send hashtags around and really try to create this message that it wasn't worth it to vote for Hillary Clinton. It just wasn't worth it to vote at all.
I don't think African Americans are going to come out and vote for Clinton. They're too smart and they know they're being used.
And so we're seeing a lot of that in 2020, again, this time kind of coming from Americans. Another really big claim that we've seen from the president was that he's going to send local law enforcement and sheriffs to the polls.
We're going to have sheriffs and we're going to have law enforcement and we're going to have hopefully U.S. attorneys and we're going to have everybody and attorney generals.
We heard from prominent voter advocates that the president doesn't have the authority to do that. Just the suggestion of it actually might end up deterring some voters from going to the polls because there's a very long history in this country, especially among Black voters and minority voters of this actually being a real thing. It doesn't have to be true for it to have an impact on the election. Just floating it out there is likely to have a very big impact if no one trusts a different source enough to debunk it. The most proactive social media platform has been Twitter for the most part because they, have taken tweets down, even Donald Trump's own tweets. They have attached little warnings with real voting information whenever he makes false claims. But Facebook has actually done much less. Facebook has been the platform both in 2016 and now where most of it goes. Democrats say that they're just letting Trump's posts go, completely without any fact checking. And Republicans say that all these social media platforms have a big anti-conservative bias.
They mailed 1,000 ballots out. Unfortunately, they doubled it up and everybody in this Democrat area got 2 ballots instead of 1. And then 2 days ago, they found 8 ballots in a waste paper basket. Unfortunately, they all had the name Trump written on them. We were going to vote for Trump. They were military ballots, the military.
So one of the most popular ones we saw was, for example, people receiving ballots or voting information in the mail for several people because several people live out at their address and then posting it and saying, this is clearly fraud. I could just fill all these out and send them back. And this all really falls under the same umbrella of the misinformation that mail-in voting is going to be fraudulent. And actually many states, until recently, for example, Florida, Republicans are the ones who benefited the most from mail-in ballots. So it's kind of backfiring in a way.
A lot of the election officials that I've spoken to have run into a lot of the same problems. So there's a shortage in poll workers, there's a need for clarity and a need for more funding. It's a very big system with a lot of differences from place to place that has had to turn on a dime. I've spoken with a lot of protesters here in Washington recently who had serious concerns about whether they could trust the U.S. Postal Service with their ballot.
And this time they're trying to do it with the whole post office scam. They'll blame it on the post office. You could see them setting it up Be very careful and watch it very carefully.
In May, Postmaster General Louis DeJoy was appointed. He immediately implemented a slew of cost-cutting measures. And there were reports that overtime was being eliminated, sorting machines were removed, and this, again, is complicated because sorting machines are removed every year, but apparently they were being removed in greater quantities this year. He announced after a month of these changes that he was suspending them.
The Democrats want to portray you as implementing new policies because of the false narrative that the president wants to somehow sabotage the election. Is that narrative true?
I am not engaged in sabotaging the election.
He's a big Republican donor. His donations to Republican candidates predate Trump. Just the fact that DeJoy is a big supporter of President Trump raised a lot of questions about whether there was anything politically in it for him.
DeJoy has clearly been handmaiden to Donald Trump in this, but the American people have seen it, and they don't like it in terms of voting.
Vote by mail is totally reliable and secure, and election officials are really trying to drill down on that. But it has gotten lost a little bit in this national narrative, and it's a way to keep voters safe and from potential exposure to COVID-19 when they go to the polls. There are a lot of things that voters have in their control that they should do. So one, make sure that you're registered. And if you're registered, make sure that information is up to date as a voter. If you live in a state where you need to request an absentee ballot, make sure you do that right away. So just try to give yourself as many options as possible. Put yourself in a situation where as soon as you know who you're voting for, you cast that ballot.
We call November 3rd Election Day, but it's really the culmination of a long election period. Different states have different rules, different dates for early voting, for mail voting, but all over the country, people will have been submitting their votes for weeks or even months by the time Election Day gets here. But if people don't trust the results of an election, democracy basically falls apart. A lot of experts, particularly on the left, worry that President Trump might refuse to concede the election or even refuse to leave office if he loses.
Do you commit to making sure that there's a peaceful transfer of power?
We want to get rid of the ballots, and we'll have a very peaceful. There won't be a transfer, frankly. There'll be a continuation. The ballots are out of control. You know it. And you know who knows it better than anybody else? The Democrats know it better than anybody else. Go ahead.
There's also a concern that all of the conspiracy theories and lies he's been spreading about how voting works will cause a lot of people to refuse to accept the election results themselves. That's really dangerous. Some analysts talk about something called a red mirage, where the votes cast on election day in certain states heavily favor Trump and the Republican candidates, but then the mail ballots come in, start getting counted, and the Democrats do a lot better or even win. And the really important part of this is just because we don't know who won on election night does not mean anything bad is happening. Some places like California are used to this. It's been the case in their elections for a while that it takes a few days. Lots of other people are just accustomed to knowing who won on election night, and that creates an opening for mischief, for people to claim that something sneaky is happening. In some states, they aren't even allowed to legally start counting all of those mail ballots and early ballots until after the polls close on election night. In other states, there's a rule that ballots have to be postmarked but not necessarily received by a certain date, so they'll still be getting ballots coming in for several days. The point is, it could take a while before we know who has actually won.